Dr. Diana Muchai, who is a research manager at the African Economic Research Consortium, the best ever research manager, I must say. We've been working together for a few years and actually making it all happen, making the research happen, and that's a fantastic job. We are also very fortunate to have Martin Tabi here, who is the Director General for Economic Development from Global Affairs, who are supporting the IDRC and a range of other bodies to do analysis, like we're going to hear today, on African economies, how they are responding to shocks, and then we hope to hear how, what implications this might have for the reform of the global financial architecture. And of course, Martin is at the forefront of these discussions from the Canadian perspective, so we're looking forward to hearing from him as well. Now, we also have two other people on the panel who are also amongst the movers and shakers and main consumers from the research by the African Economic Research Consortium. So we also have Catherine Toure here, who is the research director based here in Nairobi for the IDRC, responsible for a range of programs on research, on trade issues, AfCFTA, but also on shocks and of course the work that we're going to discuss today. So, and we also were already organizing a meeting jointly on Monday, also jointly with the ARC, ODI and IDRC, where we also heard from, for example, the research that's been undertaken on global wars and the effect it may have on African countries, and also where the Minister of Finance from Somalia really talked about the need to reform the global financial architecture. And so there's a nice link to this meeting as well. And we also have here on the panel who we will be hearing more from on the second part of this meeting is Professor Victor Morinda. Professor Victor Morinda is the incoming executive director of the African Economic Research Consortium, which is a leading think tank producing high quality research, the best quality research on the African continent, and also with fantastic networks around policymakers to make sure that the findings are also get uptake and impact in the African economic policymaker community. He's also a colleague at the University of SOAS University of London. I'm a director for international economic development at ODI. So I'm really interested to hear more on the research, but first we have the introductory remarks by Dr. Diana Muchai first. If you'd like to come here to the podium, then we can hear from you.
Right, thank you very much. As you've heard, my name is Diana Muchai, the research manager at ARC. First and foremost, on behalf of my director who is here and the research director, I would like to welcome you to this event, and we look forward for a fruitful discussion. Allow me to say this, that this session, which is organized by ARC in collaboration with ODI, of course is supportive, with a lot of support from IDRC. It's aimed at sharing evidence and practical policy proposals on reforms for a global financial architecture that works for all countries and stakeholders, and which also strengthens national economic policy. Some of the presentations that are going to be made here are hinged on two collaborative projects that are also being funded by IDRC. We have Inclusive Finance for Fragile and Post-Conflict States in Africa, and we have Social and Economic Response and Recovery from COVID-19. One of the things we need to note is that as much as we are talking about making the global financial architecture work for African countries, there's need for new global financial architecture that addresses the continent's interests. In these studies, we have realized that each country has its own specific needs, especially the fragile countries. We looked at them in the studies, and we found that all of them are peculiar in one way or the other. So when you're looking at global financial architecture, what are we really looking at? One of the things I've heard being talked much is about the reforms that are going to be undertaken, and I'm missing an element there of how these reforms are going to be specific to these countries, specific to the agenda, and specific to other things. It's just we are having sort of some blanket policies that are being made. And so what we'd want to see even at the end of the session is advocating for reforms for them that are fit for purpose and serve Africa's development priorities. And I want to reiterate that are specific to the countries. In the study for social and economic response and recovery from COVID-19, we have seen that different countries have been affected differently by, of course, COVID-19 and, of course, the other shocks that have been there, be it climate change, be it the war in Ukraine. And all these cause a lot of gender inequalities and, of course, other inequalities thereby. And so, at the end of the day, when we are looking at the reforms of global financial architecture, we would also want to see them take into account the ongoing emerging geopolitical uncertainties, the Russia-Ukraine war, persistent regional conflicts, which have economic, social, and political consequences for Africa. And so we would look at an architecture that must address all these issues at the same time beyond the perceived trade-offs between middle and low-income countries. And so I would want also to mention that a good financial architecture for African countries should have some several characteristics. And again, these characteristics which you are looking at, and of course they were mentioned in one of the main AfDB events, are they also, again, specific? We are talking about long-term financing, low interest rates, looking at the concessional financing, of course, you know, architecture that is flexible, responding to shocks in the economies, and of course, that is also sensitive. I'm glad that this session is looking at several issues, and we're going to hear them as we proceed, how governments and financial institutions can collaborate to increase access to affordable financial services. We're also going to talk about regulatory and policy frameworks, measures that can be taken to increase the accessibility and availability of concessional financing. We're also going to look at how global financial regulations and standards can be adjusted, and all these things will be coming out as we proceed with the sessions. So we'd expect at the end of this session that we are having strategies to make the global financial architecture work for African countries. And of course, allow me once again to thank the IDRC for supporting this event, for supporting all the projects we have done. We have over 5 projects, which you'll hear them, you know, being mentioned as we proceed by the next presenters. And also thank all key stakeholders who are in this event, and each and every one of you. As on behalf of ARC again, my executive director and my director of research, I would like to warmly welcome you as we shape the new research findings, pave way for new policy directions, and initiate innovative practices in the areas of global financial architecture. Thank you.
From Martin Tabi. Canadian officials speak 2 languages and more, but we also have translation. So if you would like to hear everything in French, you need to push 1 on your translator device. If you like to hear everything in English, then it's number 2. So you can ask questions also in French and make comments in French, and you can talk in French and in English, both languages. Martin Tabi, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for Doctor. Thank you very much. I can see why you would be called the best manager ever. Tough act to follow. I'll speak a little bit in French. You can probably detect that I'm francophone, but most of my comments will be in English so that you don't have to switch back and forth. I did that yesterday at the AfDB, and I can see the commotion every time we're doing this. So, Catherine, thank you for reaching out and inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. Oh, sorry. Is it better? Okay. we can continue. Okay, it's better. Okay, I hope you heard a little bit of what I said. So, thank you, Catherine. Professor Murundi, it's a delight also to be in your company. Dear participants, welcome and thank you for being here. L'architecture financière mondiale est une préoccupation de l'heure. Plusieurs leaders de l'Afrique hier se sont joints au président Ruto pour de fructueuses discussions portant notamment sur la réforme des institutions. This event today is very timely and aligns very well with the African leaders' discussion yesterday morning at the AfDB. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you all at this important discussion on making the global financial architecture work for African countries. This is a topic of key priorities for my bureau back in Canada at Global Affairs, but also for Finance Canada, where I used to be back in August of last year for 3 years prior to that as the IDA deputy and covering also other banks as well. So it's a shared mandate between the two departments in Canada, and we work together very well at focusing on that kind of issue. So this week, I'm here as the governor of the African Development Bank, one of the governors recently, and I'm sharing this with you because our positioning on IFI reforms is very coherent and consistent globally and across the board with all the different banks. And my colleagues working at Finance Canada, representing Canada at other banks, including at the World Bank, are also holding very similar positions, and I'll share a bit with you a little bit later these positions. Later this month, we will be hosting in Canada the Caribbean Development Bank annual meeting, and I can predict already that our positioning on all of this will be very similar. So I'm very happy to be able to join for today's discussion at the invitation of our sister organization, Canada's International Development Research Center, or IDRC. IDRC was created in 1970, a very good year for creation, was born in 70, by the Canadian Parliament to support Global South organizations to carry out research in line with Global South development challenges and aspirations. IDRC investments in Africa are in line with Agenda 2063 of the African Union and with Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, which focuses on gender, obviously, but more broadly on inclusivity and on climate. For AfDB colleagues, it would also align very well with the new 10-year strategy, especially with the I-5s that is well known and discussed this week. Today's event is an opportunity to discuss evidence and policy proposals for a reformed global financial architecture, one that works for all African countries and communities. In addition to looking at the global level, I know it is also important to discuss strengthening national economic policy making, including the establishment of solid macroeconomic fundamentals and robust regulatory and legislative frameworks. This morning, the chief economist at the AfDB was presenting the economic outlook, a very interesting presentation. If you have not looked at it yet, you should. There's a mention of $600 billion that is an outflow out of the continent because of the macroeconomic fundamentals and things that could be improved. So worth looking at this in terms of metrics to focus on. I'm sure there's many other data sets available and information point that we can consider, but that's one key element that I wanted to flag from you from this morning's session. The impact of the COVID pandemic, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and persistent regional conflicts that have socioeconomic and political consequences for Africa have amplified the fact that the current system no longer responds to the needs of Africa and globally. Sharing a bit of Canada's thinking, I first want to recognize the current context of very significant and ever-increasing needs, especially in Africa, and limited resources everywhere. A reform cannot just be about more public funds, more grants, and very concessional loans. It is key, it is important, but we also need to innovate. Capital efficiency, like the G20 CAF process, needs to remain an ongoing process. It cannot be every 10-year consideration, and then we put that back on the shelf and we come back to it too long later down the road. Operational and institutional efficiency is also needed as well. Duplication versus collaboration needs to be seriously considered, and amongst different players in one country, MDBs, DFIs, other organizations working together, better together, avoiding duplication and reducing burden. Reducing burden, especially for countries that we're trying to help. To be careful with the creation of new structures, we need to make the ones that we have working better. We need to have a simplified architecture so that also we can work better with the private sector, which is telling us that is a very complex environment to operate in. Reducing the burden on borrowing countries, like why do we have so many country platforms, country assessment, country diagnostic from all the different players in the same country without talking to each other, leading to a different kind of set of priorities from one organization to the other? Why don't we keep borrowing countries central to the setting of priorities so that, as the doctor mentioned, we have a fit-for-purpose type of structure better aligned with the needs of the country and specifically aligned with every single country. We need to adopt different incentives for staff in countries for collaboration with public and private sector entities. That's essential. Speaking about the private sector, private capital mobilization is a difficult challenge to tackle, and we have not yet achieved the expected results based on the potential that it represents. So tackling this is certainly very important, something that personally I'm pushing for in the context of next year, which is going to be Canada's G7 presidency. And the G7 thing, I know it's only 7 countries, I'm well aware of that. Italy this year is a good example, making some room for Africa. So the G7 is not just for 7 countries. So there's space to discuss issues like private capital mobilization, which is a global issue. It's not an issue for 7 countries. So I really hope that this is something along the lines of many other priorities that we could consider in the future. I'll stop here in terms of Canadian perspective, but I hope you can feel the passion that I have for all of this. I'm here to learn. You have research, data, your evidence-based policy, perspective outside of being so close to the issue like we are on a daily basis involved with the banks. Your contribution is essential, very important. Research, analysis, we need to continue to exchange and learn from you. I'm confident that today's discussion will enrich the debates around reforms of the global financial system, as well as necessary reforms at the national levels. I'm also hopeful that through informal networking, new and meaningful alliances and partnership will emerge among participants in today's discussion. I would like to appreciate the African Economic Research Consortium for this evidence-based discussion on making the global financial architecture work for African countries, including youth, women, and persons in fragile and post-conflict states. The evidence to be shared draws on IDRC-funded research on promoting leadership for economic policy in fragile countries in Africa. I would also like to recognize the Overseas Development Institute, known as ODI, and the African Development Bank for helping to make this event happen. Thank you for being here today to share from your experience and contribute to rethinking the global financial architecture and concomitant national reforms. Je nous souhaite une discussion très fructueuse ce matin. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you very much. Panel, you could now please take your seat, and we go to the next session. So these were fantastic remarks, and also really getting a bit of an understanding of how so like a shareholder is thinking about these common positions across the various regional development banks and talking about issues like efficiency, collaboration, simplification, private sector capital mobilization, etc. And so we will want to be hearing on these issues also in the discussion later today. So now we move to the substance of the discussion. So I'd like to invite the two intellectual giants behind the research. So Abi Kadir and Abebe Shimeles to take a seat here. And so they'll be doing a 10 minutes presentation each, I've been promised, on underlying research. So Abi Kadir will talk about inclusive finance for fragile and post-conflict states in Africa, that research that has been undertaken, as well as the research has been undertaken on social and economic response and recovery from COVID-19 as well, and then drawing some insights on what that might mean for the global financial architecture. And then we will have a comment from Abebe on sort of also the policy implications, and he is an economic advisor a senior economic advisor to the government of Ethiopia, and so really interested to hear from his position as well. And he's of course also been linked to the AERC previously as well. Okay, over to you, Abi. Would you like to make the first presentation? I hope there's a PowerPoint.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. This is not only going to be a session of two economists, but it is also a session of two Ethiopians. And it is also a session of two research directors, because he was a former research director of ARC before me. I would really like to first thank my staff. Yesterday when I was preparing my presentation, I was talking to not only to my economics colleagues, but also my staff like Pamela, who is working under Diana, and also to IT people. And I said to them, what is boring about economists? And they told me that you should really use analogies, examples, and make your presentation lively. And I took that to heart, and I should thank them for the insight, one. Two, I should also thank Obadia, who prepared the first ground set of slides for me. And I apologize to you because I changed it based on the evidence I got or the advice I got from Emmanuel as well as Pamela, Sylvia, and so on. Okay, I think under this topic, what I'm going to discuss is how financial inclusion shocks, and they are also linked to reforms in the global financial architecture. There was a very good introduction by Diana, the manager who is working with me. I should add to the compliments made to her. Without her, I think we couldn't really manage to do the work that we do in the collaborative arm of the ARC. So thank you, Diana. And this project, the two projects that she mentioned on financial inclusion and the impact of COVID, resulted in very good evidence. And I thank IDRC for funding these two projects, one. Two, not only for funding it, but also to address our strategic direction, because you helped us to work in Francophone countries, Anglophone countries, and Lusophone countries. And you also helped us to work on marginalized, vulnerable, and neglected groups of countries. So why does that matter to link the financial inclusion project and also the COVID pandemic project with the global financial architecture? It is very important because for the following reasons. If you look at the current financial architecture, by design, it is rigged against poor countries. By design, it is rigged against African countries. By design, it is rigged against least developed countries. And more importantly, it is rigged against those countries which are forgotten, like the fragile and the post-conflict countries of this planet, like Somalia, DRC, CAR, Mali, Burundi, Mozambique, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. We have worked with the IDRC in these projects to cover those countries that really matter. They shouldn't be marginalized. And global financial architecture, which is rigged against these countries, should really be working. The only way that it can work is not under the current architecture, because if you look at the current architecture, you are investor. These are very highly risky countries. You will not invest. Therefore, current capital flows will not go there. The capital flows that should go there is concessional loan. I was listening to President Adesina this morning when the African Economic Outlook was launched, and he was pushing for inflows of concessional loans at favorable rates, at speed and at pace and at scale. If we don't do that, we cannot really talk about the transformations that we expect. So what is the output of the research of these two projects? Very good high quality outputs. Actually, I should thank our resource people like Anke, Professor Anke from Germany, who is a resource person in Group E, who really led a special issue along with Professor Andy McKay of Group Chair D to get publications out of these projects. So we are talking about quality projects, quality outputs, not only in terms of the policy messages, but also academic excellence and rigor. And they have been published in Review of Development Studies. The topic that we are talking about today, which I will be focusing on for a few minutes before I leave the stage for Ababa, is aligned to the IDRC strategy of 2030 on sustainable and inclusive world. And it is also highly correlated with what we were talking about this morning in the launch of the African Economic Outlook 2024. Debt resolution is very important. Now, I just show you that implication arrow just to show the link. We need the concessional finance, in this case in fragile contexts, and this for sure we expect, at least theoretically, to lead to inclusive growth. But you cannot have inclusive growth, you cannot eat GDP, as many people say, without enablers like digitization, inclusive finance, fintech, that really help those who really matter, the households, the communities, the individuals, and so on. And that also enables them to withstand shocks such as COVID. I would like to say the following. For instance, I think you must have heard and must be bored, starting from the spring meetings last month on the shrinking fiscal space, climate change, floods in Nairobi are good evidence since I arrived to this city to assume my directorship position. I am shocked by the flood that I have witnessed in the city. So it is real. Unfortunately, humans always act when they feel that everybody is threatened. We didn't act when the financial crisis hit, but when we knew that everybody is going to be involved, we did. We didn't act quickly under COVID, which dragged us back maybe decades ago. At least we have lost, in terms of poverty reduction and inequality, 2 decades back. And we acted when we felt that everybody is going to die from this pandemic. Otherwise, you are well aware of the vaccine discrimination that the fragile countries have experienced. Okay, in terms of the concessional finance, I think the current instruments like the delivery mechanisms agreed in the COP28 on loss and damage fund and the resilience and sustainability framework of IMF, to which ARC is a task force, and we contributed a paper which we have to submit in 2 days to the task force on reforming the resilient and sustainability trust so that it is conducive for the developmental needs of African countries, including the fragile ones. So at the micro level, inclusive finance is an enabler, so that is what we push for. We have to amplify the voice of Africa so that the global decision makers and the movers and shakers also keep an eye on the development needs of fragile and post-conflict countries. On the policy side, or maybe I think let me go to the evidence. We have a series of evidence, especially covering countries such as Eswatini, Burundi, DRC, and so on. I think you can just simply focus on the blue highlighted evidence. It has impact on household welfare, measured in total household expenditure per capita, labor productivity, agricultural productivity in Mali, women welfare, especially in the Gambia. These are statistically significant results which are subjected to a battery of different methodologies and modeling frameworks, and we carried them forward for publication, plus for policy implication. Mobile money, very useful for Somalia. And also, we have some, not strange, but nice evidences, which challenges existing frameworks. I think for 50, 60 years, or maybe in my lifetime, for the last 30 years as an economist, I was learning, or I was hearing and reading the literature which is saying that women-operated firms are less productive than male-owned and operated firms. And that's not the case in the case of Eswatini. So this is really a very interesting result. Increasing assets for only male households is associated with financial inclusion, for instance, in DRC. And this is really disturbing. But if we know the real context of many African countries, it is true, and it is disturbing. My country, Ethiopia, for instance, for some ethnic groups, you are not allowed to inherit assets. So not having access to assets, especially for women, is really a warning sign that you are going to have only the sound bites of inclusive growth, but on the ground you are not going to achieve equity and economic justice across gender lines. So there are important implications for legislative changes in terms of policy within African countries to improve the well-being and the living standards of women. When it comes to the global financial architecture reform and financial inclusion, I think there is a lot that can be done. For instance, the regulative framework and institutional capacity is not there, more so for fragile and post-conflict countries. So global financial architecture, represented by multilateral development banks, including African Development Bank, which is helping us to host this event, is responsible to build capacities within countries and to provide funding which can address these fundamental micro-level development challenges of the fragile countries, the post-conflict countries, and least developed countries within the continent. Okay, I think in the interests of time, let me go back to the policy insights. Because you might say, okay, you find that catastrophic health expenditure is associated with poverty. So what? It is not surprising. I think we should really provide services such as financial risk protection, like fee waiver systems and subsidies for the poor. We cannot just remove them for the sake of achieving efficiency. Digitization is promoted a lot, and I think there is no better example than M-Pesa, which is really transforming lives. We have a lot of evidence. I think within this room, I know most of you have done a lot of work on fintech, including Victor, Jonathan, and myself. We have complementary evidence to the evidence that we got from fragile countries. For instance, if I make a reference to the studies that we did in Burkina Faso and Cameroon, there is a strong correlation between mobile money use and probability of self-employment. That is private sector development for you. And that is a regional, that is part of a regional study that we would like to expand. However, I remember even the CS, the cabinet secretary of this country, Juguna, who is at the heart of M-Pesa development, he had a succession of articles in Brookings in 2019 and 20 asking about whether mobile levy is stalling financial inclusion, which is a core item that we are discussing here. So it is still an open question, because you have seen the protests against mobile levies in the streets of Uganda, in the streets of Kampala, Accra, and Kenya. So I should say that the global financial architecture is rigged against developing countries, but I think the MDBs such as ADB have a role to promote an environment and an institutional mechanism and framework that will help fragile countries and also post-conflict countries to achieve their development by providing the concessional loans at speed and at scale. So I thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Abi, Director of Research ARC, for these very insightful findings based on a lot of underlying research, and also highlighting sort of the differentials of what financial inclusion can do in different countries, and that there may be different effects on men and women, for example, and really having high quality research underlying that is really important to bring that those differences out. But also highlighting some ways forward towards the end, saying that the financial architecture can serve African needs better. There are ways forward around financial inclusion, and you have also highlighted some interesting issues around digital innovation. Thanks so much. We now go to the second presentation. Abeba, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you have my slides, but until then, let me thank the ARC, IDRC, ODI for having me in this session. If we start about the ARC, there is no stopping us. So let me congratulate Professor Victor Murunde for coming in as Executive Director of ARC. ARC has been, if at all, I'm standing here because of it. Yeah, in 1995, I started my career here. And IDRC was one of the founding members of the ARC. Dr. Rose right here, who is the Executive Director of Kipra, we were together. And then, of course, Juguna, who is now the Cabinet Secretary, is also an ARC alumni. 4,000 of us in Africa have been mentored, supported, or provided opportunities to advance our career, but also support the continent. And I'm happy now also, I'm up and close to the policy making challenges, to the difficulties of what we talk today. I see it happening in my country. So, okay, so this presentation is based on IDRC's research supported by our colleagues here. When the COVID hit, the first thing we did with Paul was, how are we going to capture the impacts of this pandemic? And then we started conversation, and I don't know how many projects IDRC approved for ARC. So one is the one he mentioned, and then immediately followed the war in Ukraine, and we had another project. So bear with me, it's 10 minutes. So what I plan to do is link the shock debt nexus in Africa, and look at the debt service burden and, of course, shocks, and the case for reforming the development finance architecture. In full exposure, I was also staff of the African Development Bank, probably leading the African economic outlook for over 10 years. So a few things were slipped to me, so I can share with you where Africa is today. At least from the perspective of economics, Africa is not in a good place at all. We recovered from the COVID and a little bit from the war in Ukraine. So there is some degree of rebound, but that rebound and recovery, in my view, is very fragile. But most importantly, the debt burden that's looming probably will lead us into a debt crisis. So this graph, for instance, presents the 2020 debt and growth link in Africa. As you can see, a lot of countries are bunched in a high debt, low growth situation because of the impact of the pandemic. If you try to do that for 2019, for 2021, 2022, you will not get this graph. So it clearly shows how significant was the pandemic in terms of sending many countries into a high debt situation. But also, if you look at the debt service, I don't have the slides here, it led to a significant decline in foreign exchange reserves for many countries. So the situation got worse because of the war in Ukraine. As you could see from the graph here, inflation has increased in many African countries following the war between the two. I was here in Nairobi, actually. I was just noticing prices going up in the supermarkets, to the extent that we started looking at prices so that it became unaffordable. Some things were very, very difficult for many people. And then the fiscal balance was affected. So as a result, Africa seems to be navigating through super shocks. One is the COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and now climate change. If you look at this slide, there is a strong correlation between extreme natural disasters in the continent, the frequency of them happening every year, and the global carbon emissions. So that is the upper graph. And then if you look at the impact on debt accumulation, it's very evident that countries that went through in the previous year experienced huge natural disasters, next year would accumulate more debt. So the conclusion is the triple global shocks, and of course there are regional shocks, and then others which were mentioned earlier, like conflicts, would seem to cast a long shadow on Africa's recovery and its potential to accelerate into a continent of sustained growth, poverty reduced significantly, and also become a contributor to the global economic fortune. So with this, what do we do now? I think this is where we need to reimagine global coordination, global collaboration, but also I think I agree with the Executive Director that we have to put our house in order. I don't think the external shocks, they precipitated what was already not working well. So we have to accept that in many countries, macroeconomic management has not been sufficiently rigorous, robust, and serving the people of Africa. So it is important we agree on that. So these are the two areas I would like to mention. One is domestic policies. It was alluded to earlier. We need to have a centralized data and management activities. We need to have increased transparency by committing to make public in real time all data on old and new debt. We need to increase domestic savings, increase tax mobilization, implement a series of fiscal consolidation. I think this was mentioned by the Executive Director earlier that, look at this graph. I mean, I showed it just to give you an example of how, for instance, spending on health was not helping countries in achieving better health outcomes in Africa. So the correlation is basically non-existent. So we need to have strong fiscal consolidation, enhancing efficiency of public expenditure, and finally, but not last, stem illicit capital flight. I think this must be emphasized. There is no, I think, asking others to collaborate and support Africa when we are shipping back the same money that flew in. So if you read a book by our colleague, The Odious Debt, I recommend it strongly. It's done by a former AfDB Director of Research, Leon Sindukumana. You get the clear picture of how Africa has been leaking resources, etc. Now we come back to the global financial architecture, where we need also a serious reform. I mean, it's not just simply providing more money, as mentioned earlier, but really having an institutionalized mechanism to ensure Africa accesses finance from the global sources that are commensurate with its economic fundamentals, potentials, needs, etc. Look at, for instance, this graph. This is the spread for Africa and for the global from Bloomberg, the cost of borrowing, the interest rate. As soon as the COVID-19 hit, you could see now the gap for African countries increased significantly compared to the world average. So which means Africa was paying or asked to pay more to borrow from the international capital market compared to any average country in the world. So this, I think, has been a subject of discussion. As most of you know, credit rating agencies need to look at African economies very, very carefully and with no biases. I mean, this is something to sort it. So these are the areas of reform we suggest. Increase the maturity of external debt when possible at reasonable cost. This is debt restructuring, debt resolution. Use more flexible counter-cyclical and state contingent debt instruments such as SDRs. Prevent rapid deterioration in credit rates. Risk ratings by global rating agents. Develop an African domestic capital market, etc., etc. I think there are so many proposals now. Everybody is talking about global financial architecture. I also work with UNECA, so I'm very much aware of some of the initiatives that they are proposing. And there is the African Development Bank proposal, which is to leverage the SDRs for hybrid capital instrument, etc. One SDR can bring $4. All of this, I think these are very good suggestions. When it comes to SDR reallocation, look at now the picture for last year, for instance, among developed and African countries. Almost all developed countries, USA, Japan, even China, Germany, kept their allocations to themselves without using it. That means it's sitting idle. For African countries, almost, a significant part of it has been used. For a few countries like Ethiopia, for instance, literally it's mopped up its allocation. Ghana, a huge utilization. Kenya, also significant utilization, almost 50%. The only one that is still sitting on its exceptional case is Senegal. But basically, the message that I convey today is, of course, from this set of research and the evidence, the continent is in a bad place, especially considering the frequency of major shocks happening in the future, and the global movement towards SDGs, etc., necessitate a new approach, a new compact, a new structure for global finance. For ARC, I think we need to look at very, very carefully. But resources are not the answer to all of our questions. So how does this debt investment growth nexus in Africa work? How do emerging global trends? I also recommend a think piece by Roderick and Stiegels. They published it early in the year in January. They say whatever development strategy we have been thinking for low-income countries is not going to work. So we have to rethink. They give a lot of very nice points, like, for instance, disruptions of global supply chains, geopolitical shifts. It's a multipolar world. We see a lot of tensions, technological advances, fragmented global markets. All of them affect Africa. So how could Africa then position itself in this difficult global shifts to improve its access to finance. With this, I just thank you all, and thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Abebe Shimeles, advisor to the government of Ethiopia. I think that's very fascinating, two fascinating presentations. One perhaps more on the micro level, and the other more on the macro level. Thinking about what the effects are of financial inclusion at country level, at different household groups, different firms, and so on. But also making then the link, secondly, to our presentation about the global financial architecture and how the global financial architecture might be able to help provide liquidity for financial inclusion that can then lead to these fantastic effects that Abi was highlighting. And the last presentation also saying domestic policies are really important. And of course, if many countries that now are in a debt crisis would have been able to use the finance to transform their economies, it would have been, Africa would have been in a better position than what it is now, as you're also saying. But it doesn't mean that a global financial architecture can't do anything. There's a lot of things that it can do. And so it would be fantastic to discuss that. I mean, the use of SDRs has been, has been useful to a number of countries, for example, SDR allocations. And there are other. Now I'd like to open up the floor for discussion. So if anybody would like to ask a question, let's take maybe 2 or 3, and then we go back to the presenters, and then we go to the next session, because I think Victor is already thinking about his watch. So let's start with the lady here at the front, and then we go to there. Yeah. If you could use the microphone there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for both of your presentations, which were very insightful.
Use the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
And introduce
Hello?
yourself.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation, both very insightful, and for the comments earlier. My name is Maud Lemoine. I work for Lions Head Global Partners. We're an advisor in the African context to public sector institutions. One of my questions is, I know you mentioned in your earlier remarks that we have to be careful creating new institutions. But in light of what you're describing, of the risk of debt crisis that's coming to the continent, is there a case for, you're obviously talking about reforming the global financial architecture, but one piece that's missing on the continent is a regional financing arrangement, and it's the only continent without one, if you compare to Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and even in Europe we have the European Stability Mechanism, which was quite a useful instrument at the moment of debt distress for some of the European countries. Is there a case for the creation of one in Africa?
Thank you. The gentleman over there. You can use the microphone in front of you. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. My question goes to Abebe, and has to do with the point you made about centralizing data on debt. What do you say about the recommendation that governments should allow public sector organizations to borrow on the strength of their balance sheet? And so if you allow that, then of course you may have a decentralized approach to borrowing. And also the recommendations you gave, I thought the issue of managing natural resources is extremely important, and that's one area Africa is not doing well. The resources we have are wasting assets, and we keep talking about sustainable development, and if sustainable development is going to consider how our development doesn't disadvantage future generations in the ability to, promote their own development, then what about the use of the resource? So the resources are exploited, and the ownership structure of that is problematic. Little comes into the economy, and the resources are the revenues are supposed to come in and help develop the financial market and the local economy. But we export and nothing comes back. The foreign companies retain so much, and there's nothing to write home about. So this is something that we need to seriously look at.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who'd like to, Dominic Nimko, and then we go back to the panel.
Yes, following from what he just said, I did hear that the external shocks, whether COVID or Ukraine, was building up to this. But I think maybe we should also be paying more attention to the shocks on the continent that are really undermining the development. The war in the DRC, okay? Have we fully understood what it's causing the continent? What's happening to the Sahel? How does it affect everything? So basically my suggestion to AERC is that while we will look at this, because in fact AERC could be blamed here, is that you have studied the shocks that are of interest to non-Africans, which is good. But I think it's also important for us to look at those shocks that are really undermining the development of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's three questions about regional institutions for stability, transparency on data on debt, which is really a tricky issue, and it would also be good to hear more on your views on debt restructuring or debt resolution mechanism that you mentioned in that context. And then the issue around domestic versus global shocks, and some of the global shocks have major effects, but some of the domestic shocks have even bigger effects, of course, and both are important and both need to be addressed. So it would be good first to hear from Abebe and then Abi, if possible, and then we hand over to Victor. Sorry, they're roving my.
Thank you so much. I think these are very useful comments. And as you know, I mean, you can't cover everything. But let me just reflect on having an African institution dealing on finance. You are right. I think the AU is discussing and probably very much advanced in creating what they call the African Monetary Fund. But also there has been suggestions that have floated around to create almost a central bank type for the continent, which can mobilize funding from surplus countries and provide it access to deficit countries. There are, for instance, you may not believe it, there are some African countries who are investing in other places, like Algeria, for instance. They have a lot of liquidity, and others. We can go on. So having that is helpful, you are right. When it comes to debt management, I think you've asked if public sector institutions can borrow on their own. Well, I don't think so. I mean, because always they get guarantees from the central government. I mean, this is what happened to my country. Like the Ethiopian Airlines, for instance, it borrows directly from creditors, but always the government backs it. Okay, Ethiopian Airlines pays its debt, but there are other state-owned enterprises that are weighing down on Ethiopia's debt today as we speak. Huge amount unpaid. Our electricity companies, our road and rail companies, they have been just dipping into Chinese money, and today we are stuck with them. So I don't advise that to happen. On natural resources, I don't disagree. We have been plundering our own continent. I mean, so nothing to say. On regional shocks, I think, again, Ethiopia is a good example. You know, we have been fighting last 3 years among ourselves, and I don't think it helps anybody, if you think of it. But, you know, democratizing and improving governance, etc., they are underrated these days. For various reasons, but we have to continue as Africans to struggle that good governance is to our own benefit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will just make remarks on what Joshua mentioned on natural resources. I think it is more fundamental when you look at the discovery of oil today, for instance, in country A in Ghana, in country A in Africa. Are you going to stop them from exploiting it? for instance, if it is fossil fuel, then that will take us to the debate of net zero transition. I think you have a valid point there. We have an issue of stranded assets because the rest of the world is moving towards renewables, but we are moving in the wrong direction. There, I think we have to have a collective action for the common good, which is, I think, a common reality and future of advanced countries with developing countries. In terms of what we are wasting when it comes to our natural capital, yes, for sure. But we can also recover it because there are some countries which are renegotiating with multinational companies, international businesses. If you have the guts and the commitment, that can be done. I think on issues of importance, Dominic, you are right. Actually, that is what we have as a problem in our research questions that we are asking in Africa. We are asking questions which are just a replication of what is done in the UK, in the US, and so on. We copy, and we don't really advance. Therefore, the conflict in Ethiopia, the conflict in Sudan, in the capital city, is not even reflected in international media because it is rigged like the global financial architecture against poor countries, which don't matter. But we are in the continent, they matter, and we should study them.
Thank you so much for both these domestic issues and international issues and how they're also interlinked and both also on the global reforms and what it can be used for and how it can help African countries. I think those are really important discussions. Thanks so much. Big applause, and handing over now to Victor for the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Doug, for very efficiently moderating that first session. And let me very much acknowledge the fruitful collaboration we have between ERC and ODI. And we're going to take that to new heights with the support of a good friend like the ERC and others. Thank you very much. So let me thank you indeed for being able to come to this session. But let me also acknowledge one important person here in terms of generating this work. This work was generated under the stewardship of Dominic. Please, if you could come and give him a hand of applause. Dominic was the interim director, executive director for the ERC during the time this work was done. Of course, was working closely with Abe, also with AfDB, so that's why we have all this knowledge generated that we're sharing here, indeed. So now, I'll go straight into the panel, and delighted to see, familiar faces around in the room who've been able to do everything possible to make it to this, at this meeting. So what we'll do is a policy roundtable of 5 eminent policymakers, researchers from all over Africa. And let me have the pleasure to invite them one by one to join the floor here, not so, to come and start the roundtable. So we start with the Honorable Adelaide Desosulu Matlanye, who is the Minister of Finance and Development Planning for Lesotho, a former central bank governor of Lesotho, so has been very actively involved in all these policy circles. Adelaide, I knew you were very busy. You had a meeting you had to cancel and make it to this meeting. We are absolutely delighted. And she is indeed an alumni of the ERC, and indeed on the board of the ERC. Thank you very much for being able to make it. So, yeah, I also, let me call upon Professor Robert Mudida, a good friend, who is the chief economist of the Central Bank of Kenya, very active in the ERC, and I always mentioned him that he's a product of SOAS University of London, from which I came to ERC. But we have fruitful collaboration with him, including a book that came out recently and another book that is on its way. So thank you very much, Robert. I know how busy your office is, but you could make it to this meeting. Let me also invite Dr. Patricia Ojangore, who is the Managing Director of the Uganda Development Bank. And we are very much delighted to have you here, Patricia. I know you have a meeting with the bank president, and you have to leave us very shortly to go and fulfill that meeting. And I'm glad you could make it and be with us for a short time. So I'll start my questions, question conversation with you, and then I will just give you apologies just because you have to leave. And then also, Honorable Dr. Abdullah Makame, who is the Member of Parliament for the East African Parliament. This is the parliament that cuts across all the East African states, and therefore it's a great pleasure that you could join us, and a former graduate, PhD in finance from the University of Birmingham. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me see, Dr. Dauda Sembene, who is the CEO of Africa Catalyst and a close collaborator with the ARC. Very good to have you here. So, in this, we're going to do a conversation with our eminent panelists. Just to pick up the conversation from the points that were raised initially in the introduction by Diana and Martin, and also the papers presented here by Abebe and Abi. And we can continue the discussion to tease out some of the issues. Given that we are blessed with a combination of policymakers and practitioners and academics, we will try to understand, drill down on some of the issues. And as I promised, let me start with Patricia. As a CEO of the major national development bank, working also actively with the regional development banks, including African Development Bank and the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, what do you want to share with us as some of the challenges national development banks face because of this global architecture and the position we find ourselves in? We, ERC, are researchers. We want to be able to research relevant problems on Africa. Otherwise, we'll spend our time solving problems that do not exist. And I have known researchers by the way who have done that. They work or they publish their work in Econometrica and in American Economic Review, but the problems may not be so relevant for Africa. So by listening to you, Patricia, we'll be able to give us an incentive and excitement to be able to focus on the right questions. Please be very brief, and we'll go around here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. So I'll really try to be brief. And I think what we're talking about is, maybe let me talk about the component of the international financial regulation, which practically I look at in three broad categories. The first one being the prudential banking regulations. Without going into detail, there are also internationally based Basel Accords, etc., the international risk rating frameworks, and the international regulations such as the anti-money laundering. I think you hear conversations around Kenya is grey listed, for example. Uganda has been taken off the list, these kind of interventions. But maybe let me focus on the international risk rating and how it kind of impacts the need to mobilize resources. Currently, as Uganda Development Bank, what we are looking at is scaling up interventions, being in a position where you're financially sustainable, as in everybody is looking for money. So we have tried around climate finance, what is it that we have to do, trying to meet all the regulations. We've done things around, taking the international credit ratings, but specifically, recently I'm working with a team, and we want to explore getting funding from the international debt markets. And what the team then that I'm working with of advisors say, you must comply with the International Capital Markets ESG framework. And then they will say, but if you're complying with the EU framework, And I'm thinking EU framework. But anyway, when I looked at the requirements of the framework, it is the same thing that we have done. But maybe the other challenge would be, even though I am a national development bank, supported by my government, we are 100% owned by the government, but we are independent because we are a limited liability company, and the bank is run independently. So some of the conversations we're having around, can public institutions be allowed to mobilize funding using their balance sheets? That's the approach that we want to take. And the conversations I'm having with government is, let the bank do this. We can leverage on the support that we've got so far and kind of be able to scale up. But even to do that, working with my multilateral development banks and some bilaterals, you have to go through the same processes, ratings and things like that. So they would not give UDBL a rating higher than the sovereign. But in terms of how do we address this, we've now said, can we have our national rating? And when we have a national rating, we're AAA. So what then we do is present both. Yes, this is the sovereign rating, but this is the national rating. So it also helps the partners to look at specifically what is unique and what is different about an institution that they are working with. So yes, the challenges exist, but I think maybe since I have limited time, as I've been looking at focusing on trying to see how to progress amidst the challenges, I think there are some things that can be done. And also as a country, and given where I sit, these are some of the things that we are trying to see how to explore. How do we do or increase or enable domestic resource mobilization? Of course, maybe we can chat more at another time, looking at the implications around the other components of the international regulations that I have mentioned, because there are implications and there are things that can be done. But I think the countries, the nations have to kind of see what is it that they can do. So need to run parallel. Yes, we are not going to wait for the reforms to be done, because we don't know anyway whether when the reforms are done, they will still work for us. But what can we start to do in the meantime? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patricia. And maybe you could hang on, and I may come back to you in a minute. But let me now, the point you mentioned is very important, because we've been looking at part of a research project on the bond yields for African countries. And the problem, the critical issues in the rating and the rules of the rating. Even when you take the differentials between Fitch Rating, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's, the main rating agencies, you find that the impact on bond yields borrowing to countries is very huge. The premium is very huge because of just simple rating, from 15% to 25%. That's phenomenal amounts of money. So I think you put your finger on the right point. So let me now turn to the Honorable Minister to also share with us some of the experiences that may be able to give us insights in framing our research questions in designing how do we move from point A to point B, point A being the status quo of the global financial architecture, and point B being where we are gravitating to. It's like a comparative equilibrium, actually, whereby the financial architecture is designed in such a way that it works for us, for African countries. What experience will you have to share with us, Madam Minister?
Thank you very much, Victor. I'm not sure I can share experiences. I've talked about very emotive issues, okay, about our continent, things that we experience on a daily basis. But I guess we're still in a phase where we don't want to accept, or at least we want to be politically right and not confront the difficult issues that are facing us. First of all, I've come to realize that money is not a panacea for the problems that Africa has. And we have to be accepting of that fact. It's a fact. And I want to perhaps go to an analogy that that will probably shed the light. One of the times that I've been working with the IMF and the World Bank, and I was governor at that time, and my minister went to the two Bretton Woods institutions. He was actually wanting for us to have a financial program. And of course, we're doing everything wrong. The policy framework was wrong. Macroeconomic management has never been right. And so it is for most of our countries. We have to accept that. It was founded wrongly, and it is still wrong up to today, and it's very difficult, very heavy to turn that wheel. We have to accept that, and once we accept, we'll be able to now be able to say how we start going on to the right path. So, and the Abe, another Abebe, the head of the African department in the IMF said to the minister, "Minister, I sympathize with you. I hear you. But I can tell you, no matter how much money you pump into that system, it's not going to help you for as long as you're doing policy the way you're doing it." And it's true. I agreed with him then. I was a central bank governor, and I think once you're a governor, you're still a governor. I'm minister now, I'm still a governor. I still agree with him. Most of my colleagues would not want to admit it, but I want to admit it that first of all, we should recognize that we had a system, or we have a system, that was founded for specific reasons of that time, of the 1940s. It has come to work. It has served the world well for what it was intended to. But a lot of fundamentals have changed over time. We have had the financial crisis of 2008. We have had, a lot of things. We have had COVID. We have had an economic crisis. We have put band-aids on these systems, and they haven't worked, and they're still not working. How many more band-aids will we put on it? Things have changed, the fundamentals have changed. Countries that were being helped by that system have been helped, and they're out. Some of them, they are now in the first world countries, but unfortunately, some of our countries have regressed. They are experiencing deeper and deeper poverty together with their populations. And this is where we are now. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution. We're dealing with technology, fintechs, whatnot, financial inclusion, and everything. And it's true, no economy can develop without the grease in the engines. So we need the money. But is our policy framework, is the ground ready to receive the money? If we are not dealing with the wrongly conceptualized or conceived policy frameworks, the wrong policies that we continue with, issues of corruption, issues of the business environment in our economies, it's again a waste. You can start designing a system, and of course when we design we have to take into account all of these factors and design a system that will take us to the next 1 or 2 centuries. But everything has to come into context. And the issue is that we have to work on our economics. We have to be ready to do that transition. Even as we think about the future, about energy, about how we're going to trade, make trade better, and how we're going to get out of the issues that we have today. So there are many issues. I think some of them, Abebe mentioned them. Fiscal consolidation.
Yes.
We're still dealing with the problems that we were dealing with of debt overhang, right? We haven't gotten them right. So we can't bring something new into an environment like that. Improving the efficiency of spending, health spending is one of those. Education spending is one of those. Why is it that we still want the public sector to be the one that is providing services, including services that can be provided by the private sector? Are we in a position to let the markets be liberal and run our economies well. So these are the things that I would say are quite important even as we think of a new system. There are many issues. We have to sequence them right. We have to, be able to answer the question of what is wrong, what went wrong, and be holistic about it, not just on the side of finance, but on the side of the fundamentals as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very. Let's give a round of applause. Yes, indeed. As a finance professor, I think that you have to get, it's not finance that matters per se, it's what you are doing and the project and the plan. Then finance comes second. It cannot come first. So that's absolutely very important, that finance may know the panacea. We have got to get the frameworks right. We've got thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask her to excuse Patricia. Now it's coming the time when she has to leave for the meeting. If she wants to leave now, let's give her a hand of applause because of this prior commitment. We shall forward you the question that come from the audience for answering later. Okay, so let me now continue this discussion and direct it to the chief economist at the central bank, the central banker, because the central banks are working at the heart of the global financial architecture. It's a fulcrum of all the ecosystem. The ecosystem, the eco-financial system is built around the central banks. A lot of things are happening, of course, we have to acknowledge. For example, in many countries around the world, especially in Europe and the US, there are experiments being done by central banks on transitioning to central bank digital currencies. Okay. I have been in some of these committees in the UK, and I suppose that we need to transition in Africa, at least have a conversation, maybe engineered by the ERC among African countries, among African central banks. What does it take to design a central bank digital currency? What's the amount of technology? What is the cost? Is the transitioning going to be effortless? And is it going to actually perpetuate the digital divide between the North and South? But specifically on the problems we're facing today, I think in a new global financial architecture, perhaps the central banks would be looking at the center of financial regulation, macroprudential regulation in particular, because that has only 17 active instruments. And what central banks do is combine Instrument 3 and Instrument 7 if they have a raid on there, for example, the central bank reserves for safeguarding imports. Possibly Instrument 8 and Instrument 9 if there's an exchange rate shock. But are these instruments working for us, actually? Are the macroprudential instruments and the status of regulation, is there something that you need as a chief economist? Do you find that it's working, or is it giving you more headache than the solutions yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Prof. And first of all, really thanking you for inviting me onto this distinguished panel. And great pleasure to be here and to share perspectives. First of all, I think the starting point for me always is to really understand the problem, yeah, and then to come up with solutions that are really not so much where you have a solution chasing a problem. So sometimes with some of the latest innovations, like what you're talking about, like central bank digital currencies, for example, it's very important to see to what extent the solution is really addressing issues within the economy, and what is it a priority for that particular country, given the different challenges that country is facing. So, for example, in our own case, we did an assessment when the whole debate of central bank digital currencies came up. We did an evidence-based assessment. We looked at our system. We looked at sort of what our priorities are. We engaged stakeholders. We had an extensive stakeholder consultation, and we basically put out a document that that gave a sense of what our perspective was on that. And we felt, despite the novelty and despite the innovation, for us it was not appropriate in our context, was not, say, a priority also. It seemed to be more of a solution, chasing a problem. We didn't see what value it was specifically adding in our own context. Because already Kenya is known for a lot of financial innovation. It's already very advanced in financial innovation, and already we have other aspects that were sort of doing similar things, playing a similar role that probably a central bank digital currency would play. And so we didn't see too much value addition, at least at that time and probably at the moment. But of course, in future, one is sort of one can always consider this, yeah, as the environment changes. So I think what's very important is to, whenever you're dealing with these challenges, to make sure that you have evidence-based perspectives, gather all the data, do a thorough analysis, consult relevant stakeholders, and then see that you're coming up with something that's really, you're not doing it just because another country did it, or you're rushing to be first, you're rushing to be among the first ones, but you're really asking, is this really helping us to solve a particular problem that we're facing? On the other hand, basically a project that we're involved in jointly that you mentioned, which is coming up with a state-of-the-art sort of book on financial inclusion. That was a great priority for us because we moved from a point of 27% formal financial inclusion in 2006 to 84% in the last FinAccess survey of 2021. And we saw, well, there seem to be a lot of advances in formal financial inclusion, and we are happy about that. But at the same time, we felt that also there were some counter trends. Like, for example, in the previous FinAccess survey, there were some innovations, and one of the innovations was that we tried to come up with a measure of financial health. So beyond just access, we're looking at quality of products. We're also looking at the extent to which they solve everyday problems. So with formal financial access, is somebody able to meet their day-to-day needs? Are they able to deal with shocks? Are they able to save and invest? So we had a measure of that in the last FinAccess survey, and we saw that whereas formal financial inclusion is increasing, financial health actually seems to be declining. The ordinary citizen is struggling. So what is going on? So that was a very interesting research question, you see, and very, very, say, directly relevant. Whose solution, from a policy perspective, would really sort of be critical for us. So what we've done in the current FinAccess survey, of which we're about to go into the field now. In fact, the piloting will start next week. We're just finalizing, on instrument development, and now we're sort of putting it into CAPI, which is a sort of automated system to be able to have more efficient collection. Then mid next month, they'll actually go into the field for a period of about 3 months to actually collect data. So we spent a long time refining this instrument on financial health. We had extensive discussions, and people wrote papers. So that was research actually geared towards solving a practical problem. We want to understand this concept because the original conceptualization of financial health seemed to have certain weaknesses. So we said, let's try to overcome those weaknesses. Let's contextualize, the way Professor Murinde was saying, and let's let's see how we come up with something better, something more suitable. And so this time we've done something much more rigorous in terms of instrument development, and we have to work towards that. So, so financial inclusion was an improving access, improving, let's say, quality of products, improving financial health. That was a practical issue where research sort of input would have had a, let's say, would have a major impact on lives, as opposed to something, say, central bank digital currencies, which is an interesting issue, and we assessed it. We looked at the evidence, but we didn't feel that was a priority. So that's a sort of a critical direction in which we're moving, with the collaboration, of course, of Prof. Murinde. He was actually one of the critical editors of this book in Financial Inclusion and New Frontiers that we're actually working on. So that's something that again extends, the core mandates of the central bank are price stability is the main one, but then the other one is financial stability. So we felt in understanding financial stability better, it was also important to go beyond and also look at issues of financial inclusion to have more of an impact on citizens' lives. On the question of central banks and their evolving role and instruments, macroprudential issues, what I would say is that since the times of the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently with the shocks that many central banks are facing around the world, there's been a need to sort of reconceptualize certain critical issues. One is that, as you know, the tools of central banks are more geared towards demand management, okay, naturally towards management. Yet many of the shocks that we've been facing in recent years, the Russia-Ukraine war and so on, are actually supply-side shocks. Mm-hmm. So I've had to think a lot about how can we reconceptualize the instruments, maybe make them more effective in this time of different shocks. And as you know, if you're dealing with supply-side shocks, what the central bank can do, it cannot directly impact supply-side shocks, but it can deal with second-round effects of supply-side shocks, like, for example, rising oil prices. And also it can deal with anchoring inflationary expectations better. So a lot of our recent research has actually gone into understanding those processes better. For example, as part of our monetary policy committee process, we collect a lot of data on expectations, like central banks around the world. But we went further and analyzed those expectations. And so which expectations are more transient? Which expectations are more permanent? When you look at the main categories of inflation: food inflation, fuel inflation, non-food, non-fuel. So we analyzed this in detail, came up with a paper, thought through it. And also in addition to that, as you know, we have undertaken critical reforms as well. We've been very bold. So you know, Kenya is currently under an inflation targeting monetary policy regime. So we made the transition over a 10-year period. And you could say formally, we formally kind of moved to this system after a long journey in August last year, when we introduced an interest rate corridor, okay, around the central bank rate to improve monetary policy transmission. So for us, an issue always is, how can we make monetary policy transmission more effective? So with the introduction of that corridor, 250 basis points above and below the central bank rate, and also some changes in the overnight window, making it more accessible, reducing it from, let's say, 600 basis points above the central bank rate to 400 basis points. We now made that window more accessible. So in that particular way, we've improved monetary policy transmission in a very critical way. There have also been a lot of, Prof. Murinde was talking about exchange rate shocks and impact of exchange rate shocks. So just tying it to central bank mandates. Last year, we through empirical work, we found that basically with the, let's say, quite significant depreciation of the Kenya shilling against the dollar during the year, this was having a major impact on inflation, because we found that about 30% of the inflation was actually explained by exchange rate pass-through because of the depreciation of the shilling. So that was really, really a major challenge that we grappled with last year. And relating this to macroprudential issues as well, we found that now we had to integrate in our stress testing analysis. So a very important part of our macroprudential aspects is stress testing, which we do regularly. We had to now integrate exchange risk and what the impact of exchange risk on financial stability would be. Just because that was an evolving challenge, it seemed to be having a major impact, and we did a thorough assessment of that and thorough analysis of that. So basically, as you know, this year has been, in terms of the exchange rate, it's been a year of much greater stability. The shilling actually has appreciated since January by about 17%, one of the best performing currencies now in the world. You could say three main factors have contributed to this. One was, of course, timely monetary policy action and tightening. Between May 2022 and February this year, the Monetary Policy Committee cumulatively tightened monetary policy by 600 basis points. So that was a long-term factor that also had in mind stabilization of the exchange rate, but also anchoring inflationary expectations, given that most of the shocks were supply side. So, and then there was, of course, the successful Eurobond issue in February, which helped a lot to turn market sentiment, because there was a lot of concern about the June 2024 maturity of the Eurobond. So when we were able to go to the market, refinance quite successfully, that stabilized market sentiment quite a bit. And then we issued an infrastructure bond as well in February that was 4 times oversubscribed. We went into the market looking for 70 billion shillings, and we got 4 times that, 280 billion, sort of showing market confidence. And half of those investors in the infrastructure bond were actually foreign investors. So there was quite a significant inflow of dollars. So you could say 3 main factors that actually, 2 more short-term factors, and then 1 more sort of medium-term factor that was just tightening of monetary policy to sort of enhance exchange rate stability and also anchor inflationary expectations. So just saying that in conclusion, that central banks in the last few years have been operating in a very difficult environment globally, a lot of prevalence of global shocks, also some domestic shocks. You know, most of our inflation as well in the last few years has been driven by food inflation. So because before last year, the previous 2 years were the worst years of performance of the agricultural sector since the early 1990s, years of severe drought. And so food inflation was driving this as well. So what we do through research is we realized there was a need to understand drivers of what was going on in the agricultural sector better. We introduced an agricultural sector survey, which we carried out every time before the Monetary Policy Committee, just to understand what's going on, what are the main drivers, challenges, what is changing, going out into the market, comparing retail, wholesale prices, so as to be able to understand the drivers of the challenges. So I think what research tries to do in the challenging environment for central banks all over the world is to understand the problems better, to provide evidence for then policy, so that you are really dealing with the problem, and you don't sort of have a knee-jerk reaction then that creates other problems. And this is the way I would see as well the different types of policies that central banks work with. They need to be evidence-based, need to be data-driven, and they really need to understand the problem as well as possible to be able to come up with effective solutions. So that's a long answer to the question.
Let's give a hand of applause to Robert. Yeah, excellent insights, and I think one of them is that basically to, in spite of what happened in the global financial architecture, strengthen the financial ecosystem internally and develop instruments which can help the stability, especially the financial stability, against any external shocks. The instruments give you financial diversity, and you can be able to take on board any shocks. But also importantly, you did mention expectations. That's very important because the risk facing us actually now combining both the demand side and the supply side. And therefore, the expectations will break habit persistence, induce individuals, households, companies to look at the shocks, differently. You mentioned something about the overnight trading. Just pleased to know that the first interbank market study, empirical study in Africa was done in Kenya. Yeah, the Kenyan central banks. That followed Malawi, Yasmin sitting here. That followed Zambia, Jonathan sitting there, and a couple of other countries. But that was, very, very, very important. Thank you. Thank you for sharing these insights. I will now turn to Honorable Makame. Honorable Makame did very, very influential work on microfinance institutions around the world. When he was doing his doctorate at the University of Birmingham, he was a center of attention in trying to understand how do you actually finance these small companies. Now that you are an MP, not only for one country, but for the entire East African region, you traverse all the region and you see that microfinance is still getting a lot of problems, these companies not being financed. Would you attribute it to global financial architecture, or do you think there is some internal design that we could address?
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, before I reply to that, allow me the indulgence to thank the conveners, ARC, in conjunction with IDRC, ODI. It's really an enlightening session. We are learning from each other, and I can say probably it's the most worthwhile in learning moments I've had since the start of 2024. And now going back to the question, it's both. It's both because the central banks, they're the ones who are supervising financial activity in economies. But they tend to forget themselves and concentrate only at the top. They don't go to the grassroots. And these micro are the people and the organizations you find at the grassroots. And they are left to just operate on their own in an environment which can be very dangerous at times. And I'll tell you, in UK, they call them the loan sharks. Yeah. In Kiswahili, we call them kausha damu. Kausha damu literally translates in English like drying the blood. You get the loan which is drying the blood. It is charged interest by the day. And why do we get that? We get that because there is demand. There is demand for the financial access, financial products. But because of the limited financial products being offered, that's why you find the loan sharks accessing and giving very expensive loans at very taxing terms to the ones who are lending. So what I would really say at this point is to have the central bank look at this problem with magnifying glasses so that we really address the problem. I really like the way the central banker introduced the issue. It's like you want to have to know the problem first. But the problem is here. These people, the ones who are taking microloans and the micro enterprises, they are actually very big in number, and they are most of them rurally based. And they need to make ends meet, and that's where you can fight poverty. But them accessing loans at exorbitant interest rates is very risky. So we have that issue of the loan sharks. That is one. But the other one, the organization of disbursing the funds. We did a study in giving, making wholesale lending to saving and credit cooperatives, so that they also on lend to the final borrowers. And we found that most of the borrowers, they may not meet the conventional requirements for someone who's coming to take loan. So we have to really go to the grassroots and design methods that would ensure that the loans that would be given, or the credit advance to the ones who are going to use the microfinance, would be taken to the activity which they really wanted to do, but also to ensure repayment. That is in one area. But the good thing is what we have experienced now is the development of mobile telephones, mobile technology, the fintech. It makes offering financial services much easier and more practical, because one cannot go and open a bank in a remote area because of running costs. But you find even in remote areas, people have mobile access. So that in a way has helped. And we've seen practically where even agricultural extension services, you know, somebody planting cassava and then getting cassava mosaic disease, but reporting of the incidents to the extension officer by texting a message, not even the smartphone, and then they send they deploy the team, they curb the eruption of the disease. So that way they manage to ensure that the agricultural produce is intact. And in doing so, it also facilitates mobile insurance to the agricultural sector. The ones who are doing small scale agricultural farming in the rural areas can also get insurance. But now we need to do that holistically. Now we need to look at the policy setting and achieve that.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a hand of applause. Honorable Makame, you highlighted very much the problem of loan sharks, and that's because their demand for finance cannot be fulfilled on the official markets, and therefore they have to seek a finance from elsewhere. You did also mention the on-lending intermediary position. Indeed, as former colleagues from the African Development Bank who are here, you know, that's what the methods the African Development Bank uses. They don't lend directly to MFIs. They work through intermediaries who then do the lending, because they can manage the portfolio much better. But as you said, that is something where we need to focus. But you also highlighted an important aspect of fintech, financial technologies, that may be able to enable access, promote access much rapidly. And so I would like to turn to Dr. Dauda Sombene here and say, what do you think about this digital technology being the solution to some of these challenges, that we can stand vagaries from the global financial architecture infrastructure as long as we can get our digital revolution in finance right? What do you think?
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and it's a pleasure to be here and to share the stage with distinguished panelists. And I'm also actually very much sort of appreciative of the fact that we have a very representative panel here. We have representatives from East Africa, from Southern Africa, and of course from West Africa.
Excellent.
From Senegal. So this is good. So yeah, I'm Dauda Samben, and I'm the CEO of AfriCatalyst, which is a Dakar-based global development advisory. I was also privileged before that to have been an executive director at the IMF, where I was representing 23 African countries. I'll speak, if you allow me, quickly about your questions, and then, of course, address the issue that we are talking about here, which is making the global financial architecture work for African countries. So on fintech, I think I don't need to add much to what Abi and also AfDB and, of course, our panelists have just said about how important financial innovation is for financial inclusion and, of course, growth, and how important, of course, it is to make sure that we leverage it as much as possible so that it can benefit those underprivileged communities and individuals. And I think the only two things that I would add would be that if you're talking about leveraging financial innovation, like a fintech for underprivileged communities, it is important to have the right financial infrastructure. And I think it's part of it is, of course, already underway. I think we've seen central banks, like here in Kenya, of course, M-Pesa being the standard around Africa here, having done a great job of making sure that through mobile banking, those rural areas are actually able to, those who traditionally work unbanked are able to do what they need to do in terms of financial transactions. So this is critical. One thing that, of course, is much needed, and I think it was shown by the research that was presented, it is you need to have the right regulatory and, of course, institutional framework and policy framework. I think that's critical for making progress. And actually, it reminds me that when I was executive director at the IMF, I had the privilege of inviting then the central bank governor of Kenya, then at that time actually sharing a peer learning exercise with all the central bank governors from my own constituency, including from Bessayao, from BEAC, Central Africa, West Africa, and other like a DRC. And actually the aim was to learn from a Kenyan governor how you were able to really put the underlining sort of policies and framework that was allowing Kenya to really be an example in terms of rolling out M-Pesa and, of course, addressing financial inclusion. So it's just to say that I think this is very much critical to have the right policy, and this is something that a lot of countries can learn from Kenya. So talking about the issue that we have been talking since this morning about the global financial architecture, I think before I talked about that, what is important is to make the link between the importance of having an effective global financial architecture and the importance of having, of course, an effective African financial architecture, because the two are related. Before you go to the, when you talked about global financial architecture, you're talking about going to global markets to actually try to get foreign savings. Of course, if you go there and you have a big demand, you are going to be under the control or sort of under the influence of global market practitioners. Why? Because you have less of a leverage, because you ask for more, and of course it's going to be under their term. So what I try to say here, if we are able in Africa to have the right financial system that can actually work for Africa, that can facilitate the mobility of capital across Africa, I think that would be already something very good that would really reduce our need for foreign financing or external financing. We will still need it, but I think then we will go and actually request a limited size that would actually be under our term. That's one. And how do you do that? If you look at in Africa, it is estimated that we do have institutional investors that have asset under management that are exceeding 2 trillion. That's a lot of money. All of those institutional investors, most of the time, they're investing their resources outside Africa. How we can make sure that those pension funds, whether it is those insurance companies, can use that money and invest it in Africa is critical. And how you do so, you need to have the right policies. You need, of course, to have the right environment, business, climate, and others. And we need to really work on that to really make it happen. What else you need to do? You need also to mobilize more domestic revenue in Africa. And that's the role of Madam Minister as a finance minister, and of course other government agencies that needs to do a better job, because the more you can sort of mobilize internally, the less you would need to borrow from abroad, and of course the less you would, the more you would reduce your debt, and that's very much critical. Now, talking about the global financial architecture, I think when we talked about that, usually what is meant is many issues. First of all, it is how, and of course I'm talking about from the perspective of developing countries. I think talking about development finance architecture would be even more appropriate, because we are talking about first the reform of the multilateral development banks. I think the Canadian official who talked earlier talked about that, the issues about CAF reforms. So how you can make sure that multilateral development banks like the World Bank, AfDB, and other around the world, European Investment Bank and others, would have more resources to respond and to actually help developing countries, including those who are in Africa, be able to respond to their, sort of meet their need. I think that's the issue we are talking about. The CAF reform is critical. It was commissioned by the G20 under the Italian presidency, and they have come up under the, of course, chairmanship of Franny Loce, and they came up with some very, very, very innovative recommendation that could allow MDBs to increase their capacity through internal reform, through financial engineering. And I think the issue that I would just say there is, it is underway and it is welcome, but I think what we need to do is to make sure that these institutions, the MDBs, are incentivized to be more innovative, to be more ambitious, and to be more bold when they implement those recommendations. It's still, and I fully agree with the call that you made that the implementation of CAF reform should be permanent. It should not be just like a one-shot where they say, okay, let's do it today, and then we forget about it and come back in many years. So, okay, I think I don't have too much time. So I will be talking quickly about the two others. I think, and including what we talked about the credit rating agencies. As AfriCatalyst, we were privileged earlier this week here in Kenya to have organized an event with UNDP on how we can develop more sort of better credit rating solution for African countries. And I think one thing that was very much known, and it was shown by UNDP research, is that big three credit rating agencies are not doing a good job of rating African countries, and we need to address that. And according to their estimate, because of the fact that there is a misalignment between the credit ratings and African economic fundamentals, African countries pay about $74 billion in additional debt service simply because of that mismatch, that misalignment. So that needs to be addressed, and how you do it is by making credit rating more accountable and making sure that actually their methodologies are very well known, but also pushing our countries to do their job. And what we do is we need to have better policy framework, we need to have better data sort of collection for that to happen. One last thing that I would talk about is debt. I think when you talked about the global financial architecture reform, debt is a key issue. In Africa right now, about 21, 22 countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. What it means is those countries, you need to have effective debt restructuring mechanism for responding to their need. Why it should take more than 2 years for Zambia to get a deal? Of course, we must welcome it. It's just happened now, but it should not be the case. I think if a country is really not able to service its debt, it should be able to have access to a deal at the multilateral level that can allow it to solve that issue first. Second, we should not wait for countries to be in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress to give them access to affordable, low-cost finance in the global market. You need to make sure that you have effective liquidity support mechanism to allow them, to those countries, to be able to access them whenever they need it. So I don't have too much time. I'm just going to stop here and look forward to the round of discussion.
No, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. We note the cross-learnings. We note also the African financial architecture itself compared to the global. We also debt pricing and the role of MDBs. Now, I'd like to, we are running short of time, but maybe we can take a question or two from the audience. Please mention your name and affiliation, and we take one round of questions. So I start with the gentleman here, and then Jonathan, and then Joshua. Okay, please go ahead. And be very brief and to the point. Microphones.
All right, thank you. I have just a couple of questions. So my name is Vincent Owino. I am a journalist with the Nation Media Group here. So my first question goes to Honorable Minister, and it has to do with the international rating agencies. So my question is, how do we tell that having a Pan-African international rating agency is going to help us with our interest rates? Because what research has shown is that there are several factors that actually determine investor sentiment. Most of these factors are actually internal factors that have to do with maybe confidence in the judiciary system, transparency in government, these kind of factors. So to what extent will this Pan-African rating agency, if there is to be any, going to help us? And my next question goes to the chief economist of the Central Bank of Kenya. So you have mentioned that right now the shilling has stabilized at around 130 shillings to the dollar. But about 2 years ago, the shilling was at about 115 shillings to the dollar. So how do you reckon that this is the stable state, and how do we know that it is not going to go down or go up again in the next few months? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a second question. Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, just very briefly, Jonathan from the Bank of Zambia. Much of the conversation I've heard around the GFA here is dealing with public sector reforms. But I reckon that the private sector is very critical, because this is where value is created. And without the private sector, the issues that were listed here as part of the reforms that need to take place to reduce the debt burden will not take place, because domestic mobilization will come from the thriving private sector. So is there a role for the private sector? I know that one component of it is the financial sector, and the regulatory framework is improving, strengthened over time. But there's other non-financial sector which is not mentioned in this conversation. So is there a specific role? Is it the case that the private sector reforms are a priority for the GFA? Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes. And now, yes, Joshua, please be brief to the point here.
All right, thank you very much. So I like the initiative in driving inclusive finance and how that can.
By the way, Joshua is a professor of economics, University of Ghana, and a member of the Monetary Policy Commission for Central Bank of Ghana.
Finance, rather.
Yeah?
Professor of finance, rather.
A professor of finance, yes, yes. Yeah.
I don't want to claim something I'm not. Okay, so I think it's very, very encouraging. And I think it's not deviating at all from promoting inclusivity, because at the micro level, you need to do that to strengthen the financial sector. For instance, deposits. So encourage deposits from micro depositors, and that has a way of improving the financial sector, because you have banks then improving their funding, and that strengthens the position of banks. When it comes to loans, you give loans to, smallholder farmers, and that has a way of diversifying your risk. So it reduces credit risk, it reduces concentration risk. Then you give insurance to households, and that improves their resilience and also deal with climate shocks. But my question to the central banker is, how do you incorporate climate change or climate-related risk in executing your mandate, say, like stress testing? How do you do that?
Okay, before you respond, let me see, any other burning question? Yes, you introduce yourself, please? Or shall I introduce you?
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Christine Mwebesa from Uganda, an economic advisor to the president. I'm very, very touched by so many views and reflections here, and I'm more driven towards the local models in addressing shocks. And I was wondering and thinking, how can we integrate the local models in addressing these shocks in our GFA models, especially looking at the role of African culture in managing our usual shocks, or what we think how we manage them, and surely there's been. And I'm wondering how these models can actually influence even the financial models. And I want to take it on the ground of honorable, especially in Uganda we call them circles.
Circles.
They are very, to the smallest level, they seem so small, but it's like a drip irrigation. That the impact is big, but you cannot know it until you're there on the ground. So how do we take such small models into this to address shocks, especially if we are going to take it to the grassroots? We also have an example of a commercial bank, Centenary Bank. This has been actually made strong, and it grows stronger even amid its shocks, because it's dealing with the common man, the little man, with his little drip irrigation finance. And then it's building this big entity, and it's surviving and actually growing strong. So how can we take these on to put them in, especially we are going to talk about the African models that address our real challenges, like you were saying, in our very, very space. I think it's something we need to look at, and those who are doing studies, and pick them up to inform this model we are talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. And I just want to mention the issue of national culture is so important. And a recent paper of mine last year, General Banking and Finance's national culture, CEO power, the power of CEOs, and bank risk taking. And phenomenal. It's a global kind of discipline. But I think we tend, as economists, especially economists and finance, to ignore national culture. See, it forms the habits, the way people behave, the way they think. So that's a very important question. Now, I just seen a hand here from ISMI, and from the Reserve Bank of Malawi, Central Bank of Malawi, and a distinguished alumni of ERC. I think I can't ignore your hands. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof. It's really exciting. The discussions are really useful. My point is, I just want to emphasize on the issue of how best can we use our domestic resources in order to bring out growth that we need in African countries. Honorable Makami has said that, has pointed out the fact that we are worrying about external debt being very costly. But at the same time, we see our governments, the appetite for debt is very high. And that's pushing the cost of debt even higher. And we've seen in most countries, like in Malawi, that banks are now investing in government securities because they find them to be very attractive. So, and my fellow central bank has talked about tightening monetary policy at the same time. So it's like a chicken and egg at the same time. So how best do we use our domestic resources? I think that's the starting point. As we go back and reflect, we should come up with ways of how best we use our domestic resources before we go for external resources.
Thank you very much. Now, I know these are all interesting questions, observations. If we had unlimited time, we could debate these issues until the cows come home. But we don't. So what I will do is, by the way, we'll issue proceedings of this meeting, including recorded questions for all the participants to see, and we keep on. This is the start of the debate, and we'll continue. But I would like to ask the panelists just to give us parting shots, maybe that incorporates all these questions and observations. Just one parting shot of 1 minute, please, in the interest of time. Okay. So may I go in the order in which we started? Of course, Patricia has gone. And then I'll go with the Honorable Minister, then Robert, then Honorable Makame, and finally, Joseph Duan. Yeah, okay. Just 1 minute, please. A parting shot what you want to give to us before you go. Yeah.
Okay, thank you again, Victor. before I say the parting shot, but I'll say it within a minute.
Yeah.
The issue of that Vincent is talking about, the Pan-African rating agency, it's interesting because the question he's asking is what I'm asking myself. How will we make sure that it serves us well?
Yeah.
To me, it's this, that what we're looking for is rating agencies to take into account the fundamentals and the obtaining issues of African countries. I'm not sure that establishing one that we say is an African one is the answer to that. I think what is important is to make sure that the existing ones take into account the factors that affect Africa. I'm thinking about the doing business report. Do we all recall what happened with it? The politicians came in, they influenced the results. How are we going to make sure that this one will leave it alone so that it becomes independent, as we say we want it to be independent? I'm not so sure that we can do that. But more importantly, I think, yes, there is a role for the private sector, but the important thing with the rating agencies is really looking out for what matters for African countries. People who are doing these ratings should be people who are familiar with issues on the ground in Africa to be able to take them in. And I want to say that the private sector matters very, very much. I can tell you no economy has ever developed without a strong support of the private sector. You can't do it without the private sector. What we are doing in economic management, macroeconomic management, and stabilizing the economies is for the private sector to thrive. And we should always do the best for the private sector. I would say when we go for a restructuring of the financial system, the most important thing is to look into what it is that is missing in the current setup that would be relevant in the now and in the future. That is what is important. And if we keep that in mind, I'm sure we will be able, and we ask the right questions to ourselves, and we answer ourselves honestly, I think we can get this right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. So, yeah, go ahead. Yes, Robert.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Prof. Yeah, so for me, the parting shot would be, and also integrating some of the questions that have been asked, is first of all, for a lot of African countries, the current challenges they're facing at the moment are not solvency challenges, they are temporary liquidity challenges. I think that's a very critical point that I want to make. And so the actions that are taken in relation to the global financial system should reflect that reality. Yeah. That they don't, they're actually not solvency. They are fundamentally solvent, but because of external shocks particularly that affected them, then they are facing short-term liquidity challenges, but many reforms have been undertaken over the last few years that have actually enhanced solvency of African economies. So I think that's a very crucial point. So even as we're thinking about the global financial architecture and reform, the measures that are taken should enhance liquidity in African economies, rather than sometimes be very excessive, treating the problem as if it's a fundamental solvency challenge. So that's a critical point that I'd like to make. On the issue that was raised in relation to the exchange rate, the central bank does not have a view of what the exchange rate level should be, because we have a flexible exchange rate system. So the exchange rate is determined primarily by forces of demand and supply, and wherever those forces of demand and supply take us, I mean, the central bank basically is happy with demand and supply determinants driving this. The central bank comes in when you have excess volatility. So it'll come in to deal with excess volatility. But there is no view that this is the right level, and you know, this is kind of where we've settled. Yeah. So stability, of course, is generally better than instability, but there's no view that a certain rate is the right level, and that's what we work with. So I really want to reinforce this. Yeah, it's a very, very critical point. Yeah. On the issue of climate change, and this is another second point I'll make in relation to the global financial architecture and making it work for African countries. African countries have been particularly vulnerable to climate shocks. Yeah. And of course, the rest of the world also faces them, but we've been particularly vulnerable, and it's really impacted livelihoods in a very critical way. So I think in terms of the global financial architecture reform, I think there should be a lot of thought given to enhancing climate financing, and through different sort of institutions. There have been attempts to do this by institutions like the IMF that have come up with the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. Kenya has been a beneficiary. We got an approval for $500 million US under that particular facility. And I think, of course, because we're looking for homegrown solutions in the region, I think different African institutions should also think of ways, particularly the regional development financial institutions, should give more emphasis towards seeing how more such financing can be made available, and ideally on concessional terms. In terms of integrating climate risk into central bank processes, central bank operations, Central Bank of Kenya has taken a lead on this globally. So the Central Bank of Kenya was one of the first ones in October 2021, to introduce climate change guidelines to commercial banks that basically emphasize the need for them to take into account climate change shocks in their strategy, in their risk management, and in their disclosure. And by last year already, the commercial banks are complying by taking this into account, and they had to show evidence to the Central Bank of Kenya that they were doing this. So that's a practical measure that has actually been taken. But in addition to that, we integrate climate shocks specifically into our macro modeling. Also, because I mentioned that many of the price stability challenges in the last few years have actually come from the agricultural sector, climate shocks, extending themselves there, and this impacting inflation. So we specifically integrate climate shocks into our macro modeling, into the different models we have, into the forecasting models we have, into the analysis models that we have, even for decision making at the level of the Monetary Policy Committee. As I mentioned, we came up with a sector-specific survey that was not there before for the agricultural sector, just to understand the impact of some of these drivers. But specifically on what you're asking about stress testing, we specifically, in our stress testing framework, we specifically introduced an element. One of the shocks that we actually analyze explicitly is climate shock. So that we integrated that into our stress testing frameworks, and then we looked at the impact. The impact on stability has not been as huge on financial stability, precisely because the amount of loans that the financial sector gives to the agricultural sector generally has not been high, and I think that's reflected in many African countries. So it's not been as high, but still, despite that, because of the broader implications, then we specifically actually do an assessment of this when we do our stress testing frameworks. Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to wind up. I'll touch on, first of all, what my sister said from the Central Bank of Malawi. And actually, that's a question which really makes my head spin. You know, when we were doing financial economics, we came to across the CAPAM, the capital asset pricing model. It assumes that the market rate is greater than the risk-free rate, and the interest rate is lower than the market rate. Sorry, the inflation rate is lower than the market rate. But in African economies, those fundamentals are being violated. So it's something which probably AERC should take into consideration, and maybe we have our different model of pricing assets and capital assets. That's number one. The issue of private sector being relevant, it is very relevant, as correctly said by the Honorable Minister. It is very relevant, and it is important that we have a strong and resilient private sector for economic development and growth in Africa. There's no shortcut, but unfortunately, most of the private sector in Africa is still infant. It never grows. We need to capacitate the private sector and empower it. And it's empowering the private sector is not only by availing finances, but actually capacity building and ensuring that you build safety nets to ensure growth of the private sector. That is the issue also I want to talk about, because earlier I talked about the loan sharks. The loan sharks, Professor and the audience, they much as they erode the capital, they even erode the society. Because you find a couple, a married couple, when they come to repay the loans, somebody goes and borrows somewhere else and pays the loans, and then it brings a dispute in the family, and the family breaks down. So the ramifications are they go very far. So it's an issue which we need to sit down and look at it both in the financial and social aspects so that we balance it. And finally, on the where can the multilateral development banks, international financial institutions assist? First of all, we think if we can talk about debt management. Debt management, my brother here talked about debt restructuring and issue of transparency, so that we have financial discipline. Financial fiscal discipline is very important, both at the government side and these financial institutions which are there being supervised by the central bank. And it's very important also that the multilateral development banks assist in diversifying the risk, especially for infrastructure projects that would require high capital investments. So when the multilateral banks come in, they may also attract private capital. And that way we can finance infrastructure projects. Otherwise, we'll find that infrastructure projects are not taken. But the good thing about that has happened here in Nairobi. We've seen the Nairobi Expressway. We've seen, we've heard that there's another expressway being constructed. And there are other initiatives around Africa. So that one is working, but we need to just bolster that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's now finally go to Dauda.
Well, thank you, Professor. You know,
1 minute, please.
Since I have 1 minute, I'm just going to focus on that issue about the private sector. I fully agree with Madam Minister. I think there is an important role for the private sector to play, and how we can do it is by reducing the cost of capital. Africa is the region where the cost of capital is one of the highest. And you cannot have a blooming or flourishing private sector if they don't have the ability of accessing capital at a really affordable sort of rates. So the reform of the global financial architecture can help by making sure that the multilateral development bank have more resources to do so, but also we need to keep them accountable so that they do it well. Right now, I think if they were to allocate more resources to de-risking investment, using guarantees and other type of risk mitigation tool, we would help. That would very much help. Second, we should not only think about the international institution, we also think about multilateral financial institution in Africa. Whether we are talking about Afreximbank, whether we are talking about AFC, those are also institutions that we need to really focus and to go ahead. Since my time is up, I'm just going to stop here.
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our distinguished panelists, and thank you indeed. And also give a round of applause to ourselves for being able to make it and to exchange views. We have 5 main takeaways. I will not call them the high five, but indeed they should be the high five. One is we've got so many wonderful questions for researchers, especially as we feedback, and myself, the research director, the research manager there, we're going to feedback. Actually, the biennial is on Sunday. Please join us if possible. But we spend a whole day talking about these issues, and then for 4 days, we shall be going into the cut and thrust, the research groups going into the issues. We shall share these questions with other researchers. So we have been able to benefit from this interaction with those research questions. Also, some of the issues like the African financial architecture, why not? We should be able to design some of these and then compare, benchmark against the other countries in the world. And also, thirdly, the importance of the private sector. I have never doubted that, by the way, but this is comes out very emphatically. Importantly, also, the MDBs, including the National Development Bank, should de-risk investments, remove that kind of risk component, and allow investments to expand. And an observation made here that the national solvency is possibly not our issue. The national solvency is not at risk. It is a liquidity squeeze that the African countries are facing, and that can be overcome eventually. So, once again, let me apologize for this long session. Let me thank my colleague Dak for the starting off the panel. Thanking you again for your contribution, and all the panelists, Bebe, Abby, Diana, and others, and of course, Martin and Catherine for being here. It's great you could come, because I know all the people here are very busy, but they had to just make the time to be with us, and that's very productive. As I said, please join us on Sunday and the whole of next week as we go through the ERC biennial. And if you can join us this June, please join us in December, because that will be our next meeting. Thank you very much. Let's give ourselves a hand of applause. Thank you. Bye-bye. So the session is closed. There's some refreshments outside where we can start to mingle and the builder.
Lunch is served on 5th floor. Excuse me.